My name is Jason Alari. I'm the Executive Director of the Historical Society. I'm still with you, for this month. I might not be with you next month with little one on the way. Some of you read that in our newsletter, child number 3. So Laura Bankert, our Outreach and Events Director, will probably make introductions next month. But we're going to have Ronnie Boone talk about the Carroll County Chorale Society. That should be a really interesting talk on November 21st. That's the next BLT. And Laura has come up with what I think is a spectacular idea. If you bring an item or items for the food bank for Carroll Food Sunday, you will get into next month's BLT for free. So just bring an item or items, and we'll have a box out at the door, and then you can get in for free next month. We also want to remind you about the annual meeting on October 31st. It's at the Best Western. We're going to be honoring Dr. Jim Lightner, Frank Badovic, and we're going to have a young lady named Margot Capera from the Maryland Center for History and Culture speak about the Henson exhibit that's at their museum now. That should be really interesting. There's still time to sign up. I think, Laura, we have another week or so before the deadline for the annual meeting. We hope to see you there. Again, that's at the Best Western here in Westminster. Today we have Mary Ann Ashcraft, who goes by, at least in our circles at the Society, Mimi. Many of you know her as Mimi. Mimi worked for 5 years in the oceanography department at Oregon State University. She taught biology and geology as an adjunct professor at McDaniel/Western Maryland College. Worked for the Carroll County Public Library. Mimi retired in 2002. Since then has volunteered at the Society in a variety of different capacities. Mimi serves on our publications committee. Many of you know Mimi for her Carroll County Times articles, Carroll Yesteryears. I promised her that I wouldn't go on and on, even though I could, because Mimi is a true treasure around the Historical Society, and she has been a mentor and a friend to me since I started about 2 years ago. So can we have a round of applause for Mimi? He's going to be telling Isaiah's story.
Okay, I hope everybody can hear me. I'm really delighted to be here today, and I'm seeing lots of faces that I know, and some new ones, but a lot of my friends from Carroll Lutheran Village are here. So this is the story of a very remarkable man, and I started writing about him for the Carroll County Genealogical Society back around 2009 or somewhere around then. But I've discovered a whole lot more information since then, and I've been in touch with some of his descendants, including a great-great-granddaughter, and the internet has been expanding so much that it's much easier to do research now than it was in 2009. So hopefully you'll get the benefit of some additional research that I didn't have published in the Genealogical Society's newsletter. And if I should go on too long and you want to leave, please just go ahead, because I'll try to keep track of the time. So Isaiah Lightner, you saw his dates, 1841 to 1923. He was the son of Davis Lightner and Sophia Engler. He was born in Union Bridge towards the end of 1841, and he was probably the youngest child in their family. I think he had 3 or 4 older brothers and a couple of older sisters. His father was a trader, according to the census, and his mother was Sophia Engler. The Engler family name, as some of you from the Union Bridge area know, it's a very old name that's been in the area for a long time. One of the references I saw to a land transfer that involved not Isaiah, but his father, Davis Lightner, said that Davis was a Quaker. I'm not sure if that is absolutely true. I'm not sure if Isaiah, his son, was a Quaker, but the whole community of Union Bridge was dominated from the 1735 time until almost the beginning of the 20th century by Quakers. So here you see the Martinet map, not the time period when Isaiah was born in 1841, but you see it 20 years later when it was still, I would say, a one-horse town. It was one of the small towns in Carroll County. At that point, in 1862, the Union Bridge, the railroad, the Western Maryland Railroad, had just come to a standstill in the Union Bridge area and had adapted or adopted shops to repair railroad cars and things like that. And Isaiah Lightner's father, according to the 1862 map, lived where the pointer is there. Isaiah was a clerk in a store by the time he reached the age of 20, and probably the only store that was really operating in Union Bridge was right in the center of the main street, which was then part of a turnpike that went over towards Liberty Town. So fast forward a little bit, we don't know a whole lot about Isaiah's early childhood or even his childhood at all, except for a little bit of a remembrance that he wrote to the Union Bridge pilot back around 1914. But he probably went to school at the Quaker school that's in Union Bridge. It was up on the hill right next to the Quaker meeting house. His father was well-to-do. In the 1850 or 60 census, he shows up with real estate valued at $10,000 and personal property at about $2,000. So that made him one of the wealthier people in town. But Isaiah would have been working as a clerk. By 1862, when Isaiah enlisted in the Civil War in the 7th Regiment of Maryland Volunteers, Abraham Lincoln was calling for more men, and Maryland responded by establishing people in the 7th Maryland Volunteer Regiment. It was recruited from fellows mostly living along the northern tier of Maryland, Washington County, Carroll County, Frederick County, probably Baltimore County. Most of them were substantial farmers or mechanics or laborers. There were very few people who were immigrants and were speaking other languages. So it was that whole regiment of the 7th Maryland was pretty much a American, Union regiment. Isaiah and some of the fellows who he knew in the western or the eastern Frederick County and western Carroll County were part of Company F. And what you see here, and I don't know how well this shows up, is that he was in Company F, 5 feet 10, light hair, sallow complexion, born in Carroll County, actually enlisted in Baltimore County. And if you look at the date, the 22nd of August, 1862, those of you who know Civil War history, this was just less than a month short of the Battle of Antietam. So the fellows in the 7th Maryland Volunteer Regiment had not gotten through much of their training when Lee invaded the North and the Battle of Antietam took place. So the fellows in the 7th Maryland were very lucky. They didn't have to be involved at all in that battle. And for the next few years, actually more like 18 months, most of what they did was to patrol along the Potomac River and to make sure that the Confederates were staying south of the Potomac. They actually also were not involved in the Battle of Gettysburg. Another lucky thing for them, they were stationed on Maryland Heights when the battle took place, which, if you know, Maryland Heights sits on our side of the Potomac overlooking Harper's Ferry. So that was a good, safe place to be. So from 1862, 1863, these fellows really had not seen much in the way of nasty action in the Civil War. In fact, some of them, they were so close to home, many of them, that they could come home on what was called a French leave, which was sort of an unofficial furlough, come home, visit their families, and so forth. So he started out, when he enlisted, as a private. Within 3 days, they appointed him to be a 3rd lieutenant. They must have recognized that he was a little bit better. And so from that point on, from the 25th of August, 1862, until he was made a captain in December of 1864, he rose in the ranks of the company, Company F. Some time ago, we discovered this wonderful picture of 2 of the fellows who were in Company F. And some of you have seen this picture before. The fellow on the left is Winfield Scott Brock from New Windsor, and he survived the war, although I'll tell you a little bit about that. But anyway, he also became the mayor of New Windsor and lived until at least the beginning of the 20th century. The other fellow is Jesse Barnes, also from New Windsor, and all of the fellows in Company F were really well acquainted with each other. It was a small area. Unfortunately, I couldn't possibly read it from up here, so I know you can't read it from down there. But what this is something that was published, obviously, by a printer in this area. It's called a memorial, a company memorial, and it has all the beautiful decorations that are appropriate to the Union 7th Volunteer Regiment, and a listing of the officers and the privates, and what you can see on it, if you could see it, is that the captain of the company was Daniel Reinhardt, was the brother of William Henry Reinhardt, the famous sculptor. And this was definitely a Quaker family, the Reinhardts were. So I think that it might be that Isaiah was a Quaker. He later joined the Quaker Church officially. Whether in the back of his mind he was a pacifist, an abolitionist like the Quakers were, I don't know. But I think many of those fellows decided that they were more opposed to slavery and they were going to fight. So this was a wonderful thing that now it rests in somebody's hands over in Union Bridge. But it was owned by Dan Hartzler, and he let me take a picture of it. So, from 1862 until the winter of 1864, Isaiah and all the fellows in the 7th Maryland had a pretty smooth lot of sailing. didn't see much action at all, except for what little bit they saw as they were guarding the Potomac River. Early in 1865, Isaiah was sick, and he came home, was seen by a doctor, was home for maybe as much as 6 weeks, and then went back to his group of the regiment. By the beginning of May of 1865, everything changed. The 7th Maryland was part of the Maryland Brigade, and although they hadn't seen much action, now they were going to see it, because Ulysses Grant was starting to reform the whole Union Army, and he started his overland campaign in Virginia, and the Maryland troops were part of that campaign. The first battle they fought on the 5th of May of 1864 was at the Wilderness. And when you remember those early battles in Grant's overland campaign, they were absolutely bloody, horrible interactions with the Confederate Army of Lee, because Grant was headed towards Richmond, and he had lots of materiel, lots of men, and he was just throwing everything he could at the Confederate Army. So the Battle of the Wilderness was one where Jesse Barnes, the fellow who'd been on the right in that colored picture, was captured. He became a prisoner of war, and they never saw him again. He went to Andersonville, and he died in another prisoner of war camp. So the Wilderness Battle on the 5th of May was followed 3 days later by the beginning of the battle that was known as Spotsylvania Courthouse. This was another one of the very bloody, horrible battles, and Isaiah Lightner was part of it. For a short time, for about 36 hours, he and 300 other Union men from the Maryland Brigade were captured. They were able to escape, and it was all a pretty horrible time. And in fact, it was so bad that the Maryland Brigade was abolished. And the men were still in the same company, still in the same regiment, the 7th Maryland Regiment, but they didn't partake as part of the Maryland Brigade. So from here, they were going to be on their way to try and capture Richmond. And they went through the Battle of Cold Harbor, which was another very nasty battle, North Anna, and then by June of 1864, they were surrounding Petersburg and had Petersburg under siege, which lasted from basically June of 1864 until April of 1865. All this time, Isaiah Lightner had been a very lucky fellow. But on the 31st of March of 1865, and he had just come back from being rather sick at home, his regiment, the 7th Maryland, was asked to march 12 miles during the night of March 31st, 12 miles in the rain and the mud. The battle was supposed to take place on the morning of the 1st of April. It was delayed until late in the afternoon. And when they made the charge, when Isaiah was part of the charge as captain of the Company F, he was shot in the left hip. The bullet went around, luckily for him, around his spinal column and lodged in his right hip, and it never came through the skin, but it made a bulge. The surgeon who operated on him the next day could take it out without too much trouble, but he had lain overnight in a local church before he was taken to the hospital to have the bullet removed. But you can well imagine what it must have been for him the rest of his life to have what the mini ball had done to his buttocks, basically. So from the 2nd of April, when he was picked up in the church and taken to the hospital near City Point, until the surrender at Appomattox, he was in the hospital. And who should come on the 8th of April but Abraham Lincoln came down by boat from Washington, D.C., visited all those men in the hospital, and what he remembered, and I hope you can read that, was that Abraham Lincoln had shaken his hand, and apparently when he entered the ward of the hospital, the soldiers just let out a huge ovation for him. So the image on the left is the surgeon's report, which he was using to get his pension. After the war was over, his injury allowed him to get a $15 a month pension, which was later increased to $20. And then late in his life, he kept applying to get a little more money because as he grew older, the injury just affected him more and more. A little bit here, so from private to third lieutenant and on up to be the captain in December of 1864, he replaced Daniel Reinhardt as the captain. And when he was mustered out, he was a captain. And that's important to remember because you'll see a little bit later, there were some references to him as Major Lightner, but he was not officially a major by the military standards. But at the bottom of his wonderful career as a soldier, Mr. Lightner was very reticent, as its horrors were so repellent to him. And this is a quote from his obituary, and you can well imagine what he had seen in those 2.5 years that he was, mostly the last year approximately, when the fighting was the most fierce. One of the things that I found out when I was engaged in some email conversations with his great-great-granddaughter, whose name is Connie Lightner, she said, "We have this huge flag, a 35-star flag, that's been in the family. Nobody knows anything about it." 35 stars was the configuration of the flag after West Virginia became a state in the middle of the Civil War. But 6 feet by 11 feet, made out of wool. And Isaiah never left any kind of diary. So unfortunately, I think the family is trying to put a lot of stuff together. She brought the flag to Maryland and was hoping that the Maryland Historical Society would take it, but they were not interested. So they don't really know how this ended up in Isaiah Lightner's ownership. But I have seen a picture of the interior of some of the hospitals during the Civil War, and they had huge flags hanging from the ceiling. Whether it was used that way, whether it was used for recruiting at a recruiting office, we just don't know. He was in the hospital, Isaiah was, for a while at City Point. Then he was released and sent home to, or not to home exactly, but to Frederick, where he was in the hospital over in Frederick, but certainly he could have been visited by any of his family and friends. And then by probably by the summer of 1865, he was back home in the town of Union Bridge, his own hometown. And although this map is from 1877, the town of Union Bridge was not this advanced at that point. It was still a little bit more like the town that he had left a couple of years earlier, which is down in the lower right-hand corner. But by 1877, you can see at the northern end there is the appearance of the Western Maryland Railroad with its shops for repairing trains. You can see an arrow there in the middle that's pointing to a store that Isaiah was running with a friend of his named Jesse Anders. And I'll get back to the third Friends Seminary, which was a school that Isaiah helped set up. So 1865, he was back home. 1867, around Christmas time, he married a local girl from over in eastern Frederick County. Her name was Fanny Haynes, and they were not married in a Quaker meeting or a Quaker ceremony. They were definitely not married in a Quaker ceremony. But this is where, right next to this church, the Pipe Creek Friends meeting, would have been where his school was when he was going there, from probably the age of 8 to 14 or thereabouts. And for some of you who've been over to Union Bridge, you may recognize Original Pizza on the corner of Broadway and Main Street. So now it's I think his name is Monteleone, runs Original Pizza. There's all kinds of great stuff on the walls that Angelo has collected. But this existed by the 1870s, Isaiah and Jesse Lightner's general store. And so he's listed in the 1870 census as a retail merchant. Isaiah and Fanny, his wife, joined the Quaker Church, the Friends meeting, in 1870, and just before they joined, they had their first child, a girl whose name was Esther, and in 1870 they had another child, their first boy, whose name was Stephen. And so by the mid-1870s, they were interested. The original Quaker school that Isaiah had attended had burned in 1864. And so now there was no Quaker school, but Isaiah and Fanny and some of the other Quakers established right in Union Bridge proper a little school. And you can see it still looks like a school. It's now a private house. But it's right there on the corner of Lucas Street, for those of you who are from the New Windsor area, Lucas Street, and I think it's the Buttersburg Alley. But if I go back, that lowest arrow is pointing to where the Friends Seminary is was at that point in 1877. One of the children that Fanny and Isaiah had, who was born in 1876, was dead within a few months, and he's buried in the cemetery behind the Quaker church, behind the meeting house. There's another child of theirs who's also buried there. Her name was Mary. I believe that she probably died when they reached Nebraska, which is another part of this whole story. But her tombstone is also in the cemetery. So by 1877, Isaiah had a very good reputation as a member of the Quaker church, the Quaker meeting. He had risen to prominence quickly. People felt that he had a good sense of the ministry. And so at that point, by 1877, Ulysses Grant had been president. He had changed the leadership of the Indian reservations from being in the military's control to being given to the control of various religious groups. And the Quakers were given control of some of the reservations for the Indians. Rutherford B. Hayes, who was the president in 1877, appointed Isaiah Lightner to go out to a Santee Sioux reservation in northeastern Nebraska. And unfortunately, you can't see that too well, but the arrow does point. It was one of the smaller reservations. It's right along the Missouri River. As the Missouri River comes up and splits Iowa, there's a little corner of Minnesota here, Nebraska down below where it says Pawnee, Otoe, Omaha, and then the border with the Dakota Territory is north of there. So you can sort of imagine, at least I like to imagine, what it must have been like for this family, although Isaiah had traveled during the course of the Civil War in Virginia, and they probably knew Maryland quite well. The children were 8, 7, and the little girl who died was 3, taking a train out to Chicago from probably Baltimore, and then maybe the Union Pacific got them as far as Omaha, Nebraska, and then up to the reservation in the northeast corner there that was a Sioux reservation. And I sort of have been interested in the conversations I've had with the second great-granddaughter of Isaiah. She likes to refer to the Native Americans or Indians as First Nation people. And I think that's a lovely term. I think it's better than our use of indigenous people, although that's what they are now calling Columbus Day, Indigenous Peoples Day. But I think First Nation is a wonderful term to use because these were the First Nation. So what would they have seen? This is typical territory of the Santee Sioux Reservation. And here's the Missouri River looking all placid and beautiful. And these were pictures that Isaiah's great-granddaughter shared with me. Just to give you a little sense of the time of this whole thing, when they went out to Nebraska, they left in 1877. The year before, Custer had been defeated at the Little Bighorn in Dakota Territory. And a few years later, in 1890, the massacre at Wounded Knee had occurred. So this was a time when there was a lot of interaction of the military with the Native Americans or Indians or First Nation people. And again, this is not something that's going to be easy to see, but this is the 1880 census record showing Isaiah and his family on the Santee Sioux Reservation. At the very top, it shows Isaiah. He's 38 years old, and underneath is his wife, Fanny, who's 39, his oldest daughter, Esther, who is 10, his son Stephen is 9, a little child named Elizabeth, who was born on the reservation in 1879, and she is just 1. Right below those names that are highlighted in yellow are the names of 2 people listed as servants. They're both Native Americans, and they both show that they were born in Minnesota. And this is the story behind the Santee, how they ended up on this reservation by 1877, or actually before that. In 1862, the United States was already not living up to its agreements with the Indians, its treaties with the Indians. And the Sioux who were living in southwestern Minnesota were starving. The United States had not come through with the promised food and everything else. There was an uprising in 1862 of those Sioux, and they massacred a number of the white settlers in southwestern Minnesota. And the United States Army came in, and it was during the Civil War. They came in and settled everything and put all of those Sioux on the Santee Reservation just shortly after, and hung a number of the warriors who had been there involved in this massacre. But these two people who were serving as servants, a girl who was 25 and a boy who is 18, had been born in Minnesota. So who was on the Santee Reservation? Well, there would have been Isaiah and his family, an Indian language interpreter, Indian traders, physicians, teachers, clergy, carpenters, and there were schools and an industrial school as well, with cooks and matrons. This was all part of the whole Santee Reservation. Some of you saw before the talk started, some friends of mine have set up, thanks to Amy and her mother. Amy is from the Taylorsville area, and her mother, Meg McPherson, is someone I know from out at Carroll Lutheran Village. They set up some things that they have mementos from when Meg McPherson's parents were missionaries, Episcopal missionaries, on the Santee Reservation in the 1930s and probably into the 1940s. But there's some interesting stuff, including is it a Bible? A hymnal. A hymnal and a prayer book in the Sioux language, as well as beadwork and all sorts of other things. So take a look. But it was fascinating. I was talking to Meg one night when I first got to Carroll Lutheran Village, and I asked her where she was born, and she said, I was born in Nebraska. How many of us know people born in Nebraska? And I said, well, where were you born? And she said, on a reservation. I thought, my Lord, could it possibly be the Santee Sioux Reservation? And it was. So she had brought the wonderful memorabilia from her family's involvement there. Just go through some slides quickly. I couldn't find a lot of pictures taken on the Santee Sioux Reservation in the period 1877 to 1885 when he was the agent, when Isaiah was the agent. But these are from nearby reservations, and most of them are from the 1885-1895 period. But what you will see, a schoolhouse that looks very much like one that could have been in Carroll County. But the other one does not look like a schoolhouse in Carroll County, nor do the students look like kids in Carroll County. So here were the dwellings, and this would have been very typical of the dwellings of the people on the reservation when Isaiah and his family arrived. Teepees, and here again, once the buffalo were gone, the teepees, which had been made out of buffalo hide, no more. This picture came from the Rosebud Reservation, which was in southern South Dakota, a little bit west of where the Santee Reservation was, and the appearance of the U.S. cavalry with their tents among the tents of the Indians. You can see it's just mostly little white dots. So what was the role of the agent on a reservation? Well, one of the things he had to do was to supervise the subsistence of the people on the reservation. And here in 1882, he is trying to to get bids to supply the people on the reservation with food. And some of them would be cattle. So here you see a pen full of cattle that probably would have come up on the railroad by 1882 and led off, and the various tribal members would have picked up a cow or two and used it for meat, slaughtered it for meat. But he's also asking for fence posts and hogs and sheep and other things and oxen that would have been used by the people on the reservation as they were trying to transform them from a semi-nomadic people to being people who were farmers, which was the aim of the government. I love this picture because you can see what the Western garb was for people. The fellow in the middle is Frank Girard, the chief of the Scouts, and Kicking Bear is the fellow on the right, and Big Talk is the fellow on the left. But here again, and this is from 1890, so you're still seeing people dressed in the traditional garb, like the fellow whose name is Big Talk. Isaiah, as the Indian agent, would have been constantly in contact with Washington, D.C. I have no evidence that he ever actually traveled to Washington, but he would have been sending reports back to Washington. And here what you see is his passion for trying to improve the lives of the people on his reservation. And he feels it would be a disgrace to the nation and should never be allowed that their present homes are taken away from them. And yet this was what the white people were trying to do, to open up the reservations and come and use that land for farming by white families. This is another one of those things that really is very hard to read, but it does show between 1878 and 1884, when Isaiah would have been on this reservation, changes in what had to be brought to keep the people fed. But beef, in 1878, 514,000 pounds of beef. And by 1884, no longer were they 514,000, it was now down to just 85,000 pounds of beef that had to be brought into the reservation to feed the people. At the same time, down below on this table, you can see that the wheat that was needed on the reservation in 1878 looks like 850 they were raising, they were raising 12,000 bushels of wheat by 1884, and back when he first was there, they were only raising about 850 bushels of wheat. So you can see a tremendous increase in what the people on the reservation were actually able to produce for themselves. And unfortunately, yeah, if you look at this when it becomes a YouTube on the Historical Society's homepage, you'll see that there's much more detail that I can't read and you can't see. So the speeches or the writing that Isaiah did on behalf of the Santee Sioux were really powerful, and just his use of, I think it is wicked in the first degree for us as a nation to withhold any longer the right to have title to their home and the land. We're going to leave the Santee Sioux reservation part of his story. He left the reservation in 1885, and some of the references to him I mentioned, they called him Major. He was, that must have been just an honorary title for him. By 1887, the US government was granting the Santee Sioux and other Native Americans the actual land that they were working. If you were just grazing animals, you could get 320 acres. If you were actually farming and cultivating the land, you could get 160 acres per family. The Dawes Act also said those people who bought into that would be called US citizens. Hard to think about, but at any rate, there's a lot more to the Dawes Act that I do not understand or pretend to understand. So when he retired from the agency at Santee, he moved down to along the Platte River in central Nebraska, he and his family. And this map is actually a map showing the Union Pacific Railroad, but the arrow points to where he was along the Platte River in a town called Monroe, or near a town called Monroe. And he had some time between 1877, when he moved out there, and 1885, when he retired from the reservation. He had acquired 350 acres of land, and he got it for $7 an acre. By the time he was near death, he had 435 acres of land. So he was a large landowner. And what he was best known for was his dairy herd, and he had a very prosperous orchard. Occasionally I would read in some kind of an article, oh, he brought nice apples to the editor of the local paper or something along those lines. He also was one of those who started everybody raising winter wheat, which had not been a crop that was very much used at the time, but he was very successful, and other farmers took up the idea. The leadership that he had shown on the reservation and also in the Army shows up when he is living on his own with his family down along the Platte River. He helped organize the local farmers and having a farmers association and building a grain elevator, and he was president of this and that and the other thing. He took with him down from the reservation his wife, Fanny, who died in 1911, his oldest daughter, who married, but she was born in Maryland, the son, Stephen, and he had two children. He had two children who were born in Nebraska on the reservation. His daughter, Lizzie, and a son, Charles. He continued to be very active as a Quaker. He helped build a Quaker church near where he was living down in the town of Monroe. He was constantly reporting to the Friends Service Committee on what was happening to the Native Americans. He always was a champion of oppressed people. And I saw references to his visiting the various Quaker meetings in Illinois and Indiana while he was living independently on his farm. So even after he left the reservation, he continued to be an advisor to the Department of Indian Affairs, helping the people who were trying to get the land for the various Native Americans on other reservations besides just his own. He actually got into politics as a member of the Prohibition Party. He never made it to be lieutenant governor, but he ran for it. He was active in the Women's Christian Temperance Union with his wife and daughters. And again, leadership, he was anxious to establish a telephone system out there in the boonies. So he became president of the local telephone system. Where we first picked Isaiah up really was reading things about him in the Union Bridge Pilot newspaper. He always kept a subscription to the Union Bridge Pilot, and he would write back with information about what he had seen for news of people that he knew, some of the people he had served with during the Civil War. And I'll quote a few of the things. He did continue all his life to ask for increase in his pension because as he got older and older, I can't imagine climbing on a horse, sitting in a buggy, bouncing up and down when your rear end is basically still hurting from his Civil War wounds. He died in Pasadena, California, every winter from probably about 1910 or so. He would go down to a warmer climate. We saw letters from him when he was in Arkansas, or he ended up spending winters in Pasadena, California. But before I do that, I talk a little bit about his things we saw in the Union Bridge Pilot. There was a letter where he said, "I find as I grow older that the memories of youth are more dear to me." He visited Union Bridge in 1899 and said that there were so many changes that it didn't appear like the old home. We went up to the old Lightner home and stood outside and looked, but no mother or anyone else came to invite us in like they did in our childhood and youth. And then in 1914, he read in the Union Bridge Pilot about the death of Winfield Scott Drock, the fellow who was in that colored picture, who was on the left, who had been actually captured during the Spotsylvania campaign, lost a leg, and was then came back to New Windsor and served. I think I mentioned he served as the mayor of New Windsor. And so Isaiah wrote, "It gives me pleasure to state that Drock was a brave, faithful soldier, ever ready to do what was asked of him. We were of the same age and close friends." And he commented on the death of both Drock and another fellow. "It makes my heart feel sad as I read of the passing of these dear comrades, but I know they faithfully answered to the roll call when their country needed them." And then the obituary that appeared in the Columbus, Nebraska paper about Isaiah Lightner. It nearly brings you to tears. It is impossible to sum up in a few words all the lovable traits of this kind, sympathetic man who has so fittingly spoken the last words of comfort over the bier of so many of our departed loved ones, who was ever ready to lend a hand and be a true neighbor. Suffice it to say that the community is mourning not only for a benefactor, but a true and tried friend. So I think all of us would love to have something like that in our obituary. Anyway, I am open to questions, and I don't forget that Meg and Amy are in the back of the room there with their material from the Santee Sioux Reservation. And thanks very much for coming.
We have a microphone here if someone has a question. Anyone?
Thank you very much. That's a wonderful, wonderful presentation. I'm wondering, you mentioned that government picked churches to go in these reservations. Was the second reason was to Christianize the Indians or the First Nations people?
It was to, yes, it was to Christianize. It was to turn a nomadic people basically into farmers and accept the culture of the white man. You know, you've read about the Carlisle Indian School probably, where the children were sent from their homes, maybe on the Navajo reservation, and then they were stripped of their native clothing, their hair was cut, they were wearing Western or typical white man's clothing. It was a very difficult thing to try and allow Indians, Native Americans, to keep some culture and yet move forward. It's just a very hard time for the United States government to, or for the people who were running those reservations to make that nice bridge for the Native Americans. I think all of us realize that the United States did not do a very good job for many, many years, and still you look at where the Navajos and the some of the Sioux reservations are in North and South Dakota and so forth. Not good land that they were left with.
Anyone else? We got a question here.
I just want to add something to this presentation. Last year, I had the pleasure to meet the latest relative of the Lightners, who came to Union Bridge last year. The family came all the way from Nebraska and served help in this meeting connecting. And I had the pleasure to talk to him the other day and told me about his presentation, so I wanted to be here. And actually, I'm in the building of the corner of Union Bridge, where Lightner was there at the time. I missed the first part of this presentation, so I don't know if you mentioned it or not. But here. And that was it.
Thank you, thank you.
Are you okay? Okay, we mentioned you at the beginning of the presentation. Yeah.
Yes, yes, Angelo.
Best pizza in the world right here.
Yes, 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 yes. Thank you very much for speaking up. Your shop is in a wonderful place in downtown Union Bridge. Anybody else?
Maybe you've got Sam here with a question.
Just a quick question, Dean. If you could speak briefly to the conflict or the oddity that a Quaker, having served in the military, is the pacifist element of the Quaker faith. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, what a quandary you were in if you were a Quaker or you had been brought up in a Quaker community, and maybe you weren't an active Quaker at that point. How do you get through your head what side you're going to be on, or if you're going to be a conscientious objector or whatever? It's certainly had to be a hard thing to get your mind around. Anybody else?
Just a comment. Thank you for your magnificent presentation. You talked about the difficulty of the first people getting their stories out still today. Most recently, in the book banning that occurred here, one of the books that was banned was The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian by Sherman Alexie, which was several years ago the One Maryland One book. It's an outstanding book about the trials and tribulations still today of young first people, if you will. And so it's still unbelievably hard to get the story out.
It is.
Thank you for doing such magnificent research to tell this story. Thank you.
Thank you. It was fun. It was really fun to do this research, and I thank my friends for bringing the material here to let you see some of the treasures that they have still from their time as Episcopalian representatives on the Santee Reservation.